if people want to turn their video on, that's okay with me.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Okay, well, it's 2:01. Why don't we get started as I'm admitting a few more people. Thank you for joining us in the continuing series of Stay Home with SABR. Thank you for joining SABR Chicago for today's event on Zoom. We are honored to have Ron Rapoport with us today. And I just want to give a quick introduction. We'll have a few questions that I'll start off with. Then the show will be all Ron. And then if you have questions, feel free to enter in the chat and I'll periodically read those with everybody. Or if you'd like to ask a question directly, unmute yourself and offer your question up to Ron and we'll be good. So thanks everybody. A few more people are popping in right here. So Ron Rapoport's a sports writer and author who lives in Santa Monica, California. You're probably familiar with him as being a sports columnist with the Chicago Sun-Times and the Los Angeles Daily News. He was a sports commentator for NPR's Weekend Edition Saturday and has written a number of books. He's been the recipient of the Ring Lardner Award for Excellence in Sports Journalism. And today we're going to be talking about Ernie Banks and adding in a few more people. And I want to say, I had the pleasure of reading the book. I'm not sure if you picked it up already. Let's Play 2. It was a Christmas gift. I happened to read it in January and I loved it. And I'm sure everybody who's on this call is familiar with Ernie Banks and the significant role that he played in Chicago baseball, specifically with the Cubs, but in Chicago in general. So I just wanted to offer up a few questions to Ron. Can you tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write this book and maybe tell us about some of the challenges you encountered along the way?
Well, first let me say thanks to everybody for being here. It's nice to meet you all in this manner and I hope you're staying safe. And I wish we were watching the Cub game now.
Right.
This would be a poor substitute, but we'll do the best we can. You know, when I came to the Sun-Times, I arrived in Chicago the day Ernie Banks was elected to the Hall of Fame, that it was announced he had made it. And I would see him over the years, but he was just kind of a guy in the background who I knew more about by reputation and by talking to him a little bit than anything else. Well, I first got to really know him at the Cubs convention. I used to go every year, and it was at the Hilton then. I don't know whether it still is. When you came into the lobby, before you got to the lobby, the foyer in the winter, you'd come in and brush the snow off your, try to get warm. And there was a stairway leading up to a private room where the players and the executives and the VIPs, and sometimes they let the media in, would gather. And year after year, Ernie would sit in the back of the room at the same seat, at the same table. And I realized I'd never really spent any time with him. I thought, gee, I would like to spend some time with Ernie. And I would sit next to him. And it got to the point year after year that I could set my watch by this. For 20 minutes, he'd be, hey, how are you? Signing autographs, asking, it's a beautiful day for a ball game. How's your family? Asking 8-year-old children if they were married. Ernie being Ernie. But after 20 minutes, and after 4 or 5 years, I really could check it out that closely. The voice level would lower. He would start talking about just normal conversations with the people at the table. For the life of me, I don't remember what we talked about, but I do remember being startled that this icon, this caricature, this people that we knew, as happy, sunny, friendly, always on, always optimistic, always smiling guy, was a real person. And it fascinated me, and year after year I would come back. And after a while, Ernie could see me, him sitting in his regular seat and me sitting in my regular seat. And I could see him looking at me as if to say, and at one point I think he did say, you don't know me, do you? It was true. I realized I didn't know Ernie Banks. Neither did anybody else, not me. So I said to him at one point, I've written some books. I said, Ernie, you know, you really should write a book. And he said, well, as a matter of fact, I had been writing one. My collaborator died. And then he looked at me and he said, would you want to do it? Well, the timing was perfect. I was retiring, leaving Chicago, moving to California. Ernie had a place, lived most of the year in Marina Del Rey on the ocean. I lived in San Fernando Valley, about 30 miles away. Or as we say in California, right around the corner. So day after day, week after week, I would come and record, talk to Ernie. We talked about some amazing things. Again, getting in behind the happy, sunny, optimistic, cheerful image. And he talked about growing up in segregated, poverty-stricken Dallas. Talked about playing for Buck O'Neill, Kansas City Monarchs. He talked about playing for those terrible Cub teams. Talked at great length about his brutal feud, poisonous feud with Leo DeRocher. Thought, boy, this is going to really make a good book. Autobiography of Ernie Banks, behind the mask, behind the character. Then he pulled out. Decided he didn't want to do it. I think there was part of him that wanted the people to know that there was somebody real behind the sunny, optimistic image. But then there was part of him who really didn't. Broke my heart, really. I thought we were really onto something good. When Ernie died, I went back to the transcripts. I looked at it, got sad all over again. And I decided, you know, I'm going to write a magazine article about the Ernie Banks that I got to know who we really didn't know behind the smiles, optimism, the sunniness, and B, the frustrations of dealing with the guy. I wrote it for Chicago Magazine. Soon enough, it turned into a book, but not the book I had planned because Ernie was gone. So I ended up talking to about 100 people. I went to Dallas, talked to his older sister. Edna is 93. She's living in a nursing home outside of Dallas. She was a wonderful source. Talked to his younger brother, talked to 5 of his high school classmates, talked to many of his teammates. Billy Williams was sort of the den mother of the 1969 Cubs. He has in contact with him. He put me in touch. I talked to more than 100 people who knew him later than life. And that's what led to the story of, the subtitle of the book is The Legend of Mr. Cub, which is the sunny, optimistic Ernie Banks we know, and the life of Ernie Banks, which was getting behind the mask, getting into the story of a real guy with real problems who lived a real life and who had difficulties and joys and sadness and sorrows, a life like all the rest of us. And that's what I tried to do in Let's Play 2. Long answer to a short question.
No, which leads perfectly into my final question before we hand it over entirely. Ernie is an icon in the city with the Cubs. And we've, as Cubs fans specifically, have placed him on this pedestal. And again, you're talking about the sunny personality aspect to him. Let's Play 2 and everything's fantastic. But the book does deal with a lot of those personal challenges that he started to encounter, especially early in his life, but at the end. Were you concerned about maybe pulling back the curtain a little bit more and discussing that? If people would want to hear that? Yeah.
I wasn't concerned, no, that was my job. You know, I wanted to do it. The second part of your question, would people want to cooperate? I was very concerned. I went to his family, I went to his close friends, people who knew him, who knew the real Ernie Banks, who knew the man behind the smiles and the optimism. And I thought maybe they would say no. Ernie was always a private guy. He didn't want people to see behind, you know, the caricature and the mask and the sunniness and the optimism, and I'm going to respect that privacy. It turns out they'd be exactly the opposite. Not only did people say, and this is what writers love to hear, come here and sit by me. I'm going to tell you stories. And they couldn't tell me stories fast enough. But then they did something that was almost as good. They said, have you talked to her? And I would say, who is she? And they'd say, go talk to her. She will tell you stories. And I would go talk to her. And she would give me great stories. People I didn't know, had never heard of. And then they would say, have you talked to him? So it got to be sort of a treasure hunt. One person would lead me to the next, to the next, to the next. And so I had a list of about 25 people who I knew I wanted to talk to, his teammates, executives from the Cubs, family members, and so on. But I ended up talking to more than 100 because people wanted me to know. I think everybody felt that it was the time that we got to know the Ernie Banks that they knew. And I was very grateful for that, and I was excited by it. I mean, you can imagine a writer going into a project not knowing what's going to develop. And then it turned out to be just people wanting to talk and wanting to tell me and wanting to send me to other people who had other stories.
Perfect. So yeah, so this is where we're going to turn everything over to you. Let's talk a little bit more about Ernie in depth. Please, if you have questions, enter them into the chat. I'll read them periodically. Or if you'd just like to unmute yourself and hop in and ask a question, we'll go with that. So Ron, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. I'm happy to take questions.
Ron, what surprised you?
You know, people have asked me that question, and the first time I heard it, I blurted out the answer. How he got away with it for so long. Ernie was a fixture in Chicago for more than 60 years. He joined the Cubs in late 1953. He died in 2015. And after he became this great icon, and I make him to be, you tell me if you disagree, the most popular person who ever lived in Chicago. Everybody loved Ernie. Even White Sox fans couldn't bring themselves not to love Ernie. I mean, who else you got? But there was this, the things I try to bring out in the book, the problems and the concerns and the things behind the mask, behind the caricature. He got away with it. We never got a glimpse into the real guy that I tried to uncover in the book. You know, Ernie's career is kind of a metaphor for his life. There was the greatness of his career. He was a truly great ball player. I want to establish that a little bit because we tend to forget. But underneath, there was a subtext to his career. With all the great moments, there was some sorrow. For instance, one of his great moments was when he was in the Hall of Fame. And he gave a beautiful speech. He was the first ballot Hall of Famer, gave a great speech. The team's behind us, the sun is shining. Everybody, had a great moment. Well, Ernie, everybody loved it. It was one of the great moments of his life. But Ernie would go back to the Hall of Fame every year for the players' reunions. He went every year. And he would look around the room and he would see. And all the great players were there who were talking, about the great moments they had. Bob Gibson and Brock, Willie Mays and Hank Aaron. And he would look around the room and see that he was the only one there who had never played in the World Series. Ernie was the first player to be elected to the Hall of Fame on the first ballot who had never played in a World Series. It's still a very small group. Ken Griffey Jr., Rod Carew, Frank Thomas. But it really, really bothered him to the point where the most startling thing he ever told me was that it bothered him so much not playing in the World Series that he saw a psychiatrist. What was a psychiatrist going to tell him? He'd done the best he could. It wasn't meant to be. He had to live. So here's this great moment when he elected to the Hall of Fame, but there's always a subtext of sadness to it. Hold it. Call you back, John. Never mind. John Schulian actually agreed.
Hi, Ron. Hi, Ron. This is Perry.
Hi, Perry. How are you? I want to introduce you in a minute when I get done with this morning.
Did I wait to ask you my question then?
Yeah, I want you to do that then. But I want to introduce you properly, but you caught me in mid-thing. That was the truth. That was the truth about all of Ernie's career. This week was Willie Mays' birthday. And I was watching all the stuff on Facebook. It was going on and on and on and on about all the great players Willie played, all the great members of the Hall of Famers, and who was in Willie's time, in Willie's era. Hank Aaron, Mickey Mantle, Roberto Clemente, all the others. Ernie never got a call. People just forgot. When Ernie when Derek Jeter was about to be announced that he had made it into the Hall of Fame, I was on MLB TV watching the run-up to it. And they did a little video of all the great shortstops in the Hall of Fame. Ernie would be joining. Everybody from Honest Wagner to Cal Ripken. It did a cute little bit about guys named Scooter and Pee Wee and Rapid. Never mentioned Ernie. Never got a call. He's forgotten. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that he never had an October moment. He never was there at the very end in 1959 when he was 38 years old, and we all know how that ended. Between 1955 and 1960, this great era, fabulous era of these fabulous hitters, Ernie was the most productive power hitter in baseball. He had more home runs and drove in more runs than Willie and Mickey and Henry and Eddie Matthews and everybody else. He was this great, great ball player and a Golden Glove shortstop at the same time. But he doesn't get his due. Today, he doesn't get his due. He's not remembered, along with the great shortstops who are in the Hall of Fame. He's not remembered on a national scale. I'm not talking about Chicago. With the great hitters of the Willie Mays, Mickey Mantle, Henry era. So that's the subtext of his career, and that turns into his life too, the sunniness and the optimism and so on. And beneath that, there were four marriages that all ended disastrously. 3 divorces and 1 long separation from his 4th wife. Estrangement from his 3 children. I talked to Ernie's twin sons, Joey and Jerry. They live out here in California. And they were very honest with me about the pleasures and the problems of growing up Ernie Banks's son. So his career, the joys and the sorrows of his career, this one was sort of a metaphor for his life. Let me introduce you to Perry Barber, who is the only one here who's actually a professional umpire. I do make glad to say that. Perry has umpired.
And the only one wearing a T-shirt with your book cover on.
Is this my kind of fan or what?
Are those shirts available anywhere?
Perry's a great spokesman.
Sure, email me.
Okay.
She travels the country, both umpiring and spreading the word about women in baseball. She is now in lockdown in Arizona. It looks pretty good out there. North of Phoenix, out in the country, huh? Perry, go ahead.
Yeah,
you got a question.
This is the real background. This is not a green screen. This is where I actually am.
Anyway, it's good to have you with us.
So, Ron, I have a question for you.
Yes, ma'am.
You kind of intimated that Ernie felt a bit, well, more than a bit, slighted and sad because he didn't get the recognition that he should have or felt he should have because he didn't play in a World Series. And so he kind of let that weigh upon him as an adult. But I'm wondering, there must have been something earlier in his life that caused him to become the sort of inwardly sad, outwardly sunny personality that he was. Do you know of any specific incident or something in his youth that would have caused him to feel insecure or unhappy or not appreciated enough? I mean, because from what I got from your book was that when he was young, he was very likable. He was an outstanding athlete at school. There was no reason for him to not feel fulfilled and happy about himself. And yet he practically lived his entire life feeling inadequate and, and I understand because of his bad relationship with Leo DeRocher and, other people. But I'm wondering if there's something that you can identify for us, either one particular incident or a series of incidents or just some trail of things that happened in his past that would have caused him to feel that way about himself.
Well, there was no one specific incident, but one of the things that I realized in talking to so many people, this Ernie Banks, this smiling, optimistic, happy, the symbol of all that's joyful in baseball, was a construct. It was somebody he knew. When all of his life, Ernie was a loner. He told me that. Other people told me that. When he would go out with his buddies in high school, and they would get into the kind of mischief that kids would get into, and whenever there was trouble, the guy that his running mates, the buddies that ran around, would turn around, Ernie would be gone. His nickname was Casper, Casper the Ghost. He said he liked to listen. He liked to just watch. He did that with the Monarchs. He was younger, and he'd go out and he'd watch them, you know, going out at night and stuff and having fun and meeting women. And Ernie's attitude was to stand on the side and to just watch. He didn't get involved. His whole life was about avoiding controversy, avoiding drama, avoiding conflict. He just stayed away from it. So when he realized, when he got to the big leagues and and he became a star, people were going to want a part of him. He developed an attitude. I call it, he played defense by going on offense. He developed this character. How are you? How's your wife? How's your family? Ernie had a photographic memory. He would remember you and your wife and your children's names from 5 years earlier. And so when people had conversations with him, they would come away saying, gee, I got to talk to Willie Mays, my boyhood idol. But then they'd stop a minute and say, but all we talked about was me. This was Ernie's plan. If he could dominate the conversation, then he didn't have to answer questions that he maybe didn't want to about, didn't care about. So I asked Edna about this, his older sister. I said, when he became this, Let's Play 2, this guy who was sunny and optimistic and always dominated the conversation and never refused an autograph and never refused an interview. What did you think when you saw this character, your brother? She said, I thought it was a put on. I mean, the people that knew him couldn't believe the change in personality. And he had developed this from himself. And Perry, I think you're right. I think it did do to have the going back to the time when he was not sure about things. And he just stood off to the side. And he'd been through a lot. I mean, his upbringing was perilous. It was difficult. And this is the way he learned how to deal with it.
Perfect. Well, I have a few comments from the chat. Oh, sorry. Had a few comments from the chat. We have some members from the Lefty O Dual chapter in Oakland, San Francisco. Great. So welcome. Thanks for joining us. Lorraine, super excited. Missing sports. Love to hear about the Cubs. Other books about Ernie Banks. How have those differed from this book based off of what you might have read prior to this?
Well, there haven't really been very many. Ernie wrote a autobiography, back when he was still playing with Jim. One of the great writers,
Enright, Jim Enright.
Jim Enright, sorry, that's your moment. And it's a lot of fun to read, but a lot of it's very foolish. He left out a lot of stuff, like The Name of His First Wife and that kind of thing. After that, Phil Rogers wrote a book that was sort of built around the 1969 season. But there hadn't really been a big book that developed into it. You know, it's kind of a funny thing. And again, this is part of what I was talking about before, about how Ernie is ignored. There is a new book out about Yogi Berra this year. It must be the 47th consecutive book about Yogi Berra. They're all good, I'm sure. Jane Levy wrote a new book 2 years ago, wonderful book, about Babe Ruth. But how many books have there been about Babe Ruth? But Ernie's sort of stuck in the middle of the country. And again, because he never became this big breakout star, because he never had a World Series moment, he's been ignored by writers the same way he's been ignored by the baseball, people I was talking about before, about the Hall of Fame induction with Derek Jeter and Willie Mays' birthday. You see this all the time. Constant reminders of the fact that as great as he was, he's not really in the conversation.
Well, one of the significant portions of the book in the middle did deal with the late 60s Cubs and Leo DeRocher coming in to lead the team. One of the things I'd love for you to talk about when we think about DeRocher and Banks together, the impression is always Leo didn't want him around. It was his team. It was his show. But Banks being an icon, when you think back to DeRocher's days with the Giants and Willie Mays, he embraced Mays and sort of pushed Banks to the side.
Well, the first thing you need to know about Leo DeRocher is that he had perhaps one of the 2 or 3 greatest egos in the history of mankind.
Right.
Leo needed to be the guy. Leo needed to be number 1. Now, with Willie Mays, Willie was young and not really well known, and he became a great star under Leo's auspices. So, and Ernie was, Willie was very shy, never really got over it, never really became the sort of media personality that Ernie did. And so Leo could take great pride and feed his ego by saying he invented Willie Mays, which is the way he did. Mm-hmm. He gave him his head. He was Leo's guy. Now he comes to manage the Cubs in 1966. Ernie is 35 years old. He's Mr. Cub. He's the top guy on the team, maybe the top guy in Chicago. So Leo sees this and he realizes that he needs, that this eats at him. How is he going to become number 1? How about by attacking the guy who is number 1? So he went after Ernie, and he went after Jack Rickhouse, who was also a very popular guy. And he humiliated Ernie in public, called him Gramps, called him Grandpa, told the writers, in his hearing in public, Mr. Cub my ass, knock off that Mr. Cub stuff. It was really poisonous. In the locker room, it was worse. Leo, the team would come in after a loss, and there were many of them. And Leo would start ranting at Ernie. My grandmother could that fly ball. Why don't you take a lead? They made jokes about he would never take a lead off first base. Houdini couldn't get you. Fucking Houdini couldn't get you out. I'm trying to do a deal. And after a while, Ernie would look around the locker room and see his teammates looking at him with pity in their eyes. And Ernie saw what Leo was up to. Ernie's teammates adored him, by the way. They admired him. They thought the world.
But none of them stood up for him when he was being bullied like that?
What?
I don't understand it. That none of them stood up for him when DeRocher would bully him.
This is the thing.
They would just sit there and look at him.
How could they? If Ernie wasn't going to stand up, and he never did. This is the whole thing about Ernie avoiding conflict, avoiding drama. There was an old wives' tale. One of the players told me that there was a rumor that at one point Ernie confronted Leo and said, "Leo, one of these days, there's only one of us on this team who's not going to be you." I checked it out. It turned out to be something that the players wished had happened. Leo was just, it was just awful to Ernie in the locker room and on the field. But here's the thing. Fergie Jenkins told me that Leo tried to replace Ernie with 5 guys at the beginning of every season. Let me name them for you. Don Bacabella, that guy, the other guy. Well, I looked it up, and Fergie was off by 4. There were 9 different guys that tried to give the jobs. But by opening day every year, Ernie had the job back. It drove Leo nuts. But the Cubs just couldn't find. He had to play Ernie. It got to the point where Ernie just. One of the things I said in the book is that Leo treated him just terribly, and Ernie answered with silence and with runs back. Ernie just played the best he could. But Leo, it was all because of Leo's ego. I mean, Leo was a charming guy. I mean, he could charm the birds on the trees. He was married to Lorraine Day, the actress. The story is, I repeated it in the book. She tells the story in a book she wrote, that she first met Leo when they were getting on a plane somewhere. And they were in a boarding area, and she thought that he was this pompous guy. Leo arranged it so that he would sit next to her. By the end of the trip, she was ready to marry him. I mean, he was just this charming guy. But the ego. Yeah, one of the things that I talked to a lot of people about it, and the people who hated him told just brutal stories about the egomania, the constant need for attention, you know, the overwhelming ego. But the people who loved him told the same stories. What a crazy! I mean, I had a long time with Joey Altamalfatano, great, you know, former Cubs coach and manager. He was on the bench of the 1954 Giants, and the only reason he was there was that he was a bonus baby, and they had to keep him. And Leo hated the fact that he was there, taking up team on this great, you know, on this great World Series, 4 straight wins in a World Series team. But he had to be there. So, but he ended up playing for Leo and coaching for Leo, and he loved Leo. He told me story after story in the book about Leo's constant need for attention and how he was the only one allowed to talk to the media. I mean, the people who knew him and liked him just told all these amazing stories about Leo. He was a fabulous character, no question about it. But he was also a mean son of a bitch. He was meaner.
Okay. Well, there's a question through the chat from Mary. She said she really enjoyed your book. And she recently read the book about Buck O'Neill. And it's somewhat similar in terms of the amount of time that was spent with the subjects. But it says O'Neill was a big influence on Banks, but they seem very different in many ways. Can you address that?
Yes. Buck O'Neill was the original Ernie Banks in terms of attitude. Happy, sunny. What else would you rather be doing, you guys? What else would you rather be doing today than to play baseball? And people who were around Buck, who later saw Ernie, saw that Ernie had picked up on that. Ernie had picked up he picked up Buck's attitude, certainly, but also some of his mannerisms. Later, Buck came to, and they became good friends. When Ernie was making the transition from shortstop to first base because his knees had given out, knees had always bothered him. Cubs brought in Buck O'Neill to coach him, and coach first base, because Buck had played first base and he was a good coach. And he had taught, and he and Ernie had a great relationship, going back to their days together with the minor. Well, Buck came in and it was quite a thing because he was the first black coach in the big leagues. And it was kind of a big deal at the time, although it was made very clear that his job was to coach Ernie at first base. This was at the time of the College of Coaches. Remember that? When there were 8 or 9 different coaches, and they were all supposed to take turns rotating in to the managerial job. It was a stupid idea. It wasted some of Ernie's best years. But, you know, because, and also not all of those coaches did make it to the manager. But it was made very clear that Buck would never become a manager. They went out of their way to say that. He was only here to be a coach. And they gave him a uniform because that's what they needed to do to get him to the dugout during the game so they could coach Ernie during the game. The Cubs went on the road while Buck was a manager. He traveled with them again was a coach to take care of Ernie. He was in uniform in the dugout. Forget where it was. It's in the books. Tells you where it was. Manager gets kicked out. Third base coach gets kicked out. Well, Buck was the first base coach, and he would have been the next guy in line to become the first black man to coach, to manage in the big league. They brought in the bullpen coach to do the job. And the story that was told is that Charlie Grimm, who was still around the Cubs at that time, said under no circumstances was Buck O'Neill going to be allowed to take a white man's job, even for a day. That was the era. So Buck went through a lot too. There was a lot behind his sunniness, happiness, optimism. What else would you rather be doing? Great spokesman. I mean, he was the conscience, Buck O'Neill, was the conscience of the Ken Burns series on baseball. The great documentary, I believe. He was the rock in the middle of it. And that's the attitude, the memory that we all have of Buck. But he went through a lot of crap too, just the way Ernie.
Interesting. Gary submitted a question through the chat. Can you elaborate on the relationship between Ernie and Ron Santo?
Ernie was the first great star to come up. Billy Williams came later. Ron Santo came later. Glenn Beckert came later. Don Kessinger came later. The nucleus of the great Cub teams in the late 60s. And Santo they were all very tight. Billy and Ernie and Ronnie and Glenn and Kessinger. They were very tight. But Ernie was sort of the senior guy. He was the older man. He was the man they all looked up to. But Ernie, again, was never really a leader. He led by what he did on the field. There are a number of incidents in the book where it would have been good if Ernie had stood up and become the leader in the locker room, but he never did. And so the Cubs never really had a leader in the locker room. Santo, because he was the exact opposite of Ernie in the way in attitude, sort of sometimes took up the space in the room that was sort of empty. Ron Santo, one of the people who worked in the front office, was the most emotional person he had ever met. He wore his heart on his sleeve. He played the game. He talked to the writers. He got in trouble. He said things he shouldn't have. He almost had a fist fight with DeRocher in the locker room in 1970. Led to this great Cubs mutiny. Literally had to be separated from Leo. The exact opposite of Ernie. But being opposite, being fire and ice, they adored each other. They loved each other. Ernie loved those teammates. One of the great joys of writing this book is hearing from people who remember that era. And I've made a lot of people have told me stories via Facebook, some of which I had to say, I wish I'd heard this a year earlier. I'd have put it in the book. But one of the people I've become real close to is Jeff Santo, who enjoyed the book. And I was a little worried because how Jeff and his brother Ron Jr., who I quote in the book, would react because, Ron Santo was out of control sometimes. He just let his emotions get the best of him. And I relate that in some detail in the book. And I wondered how people like Jeff and Ron Jr. would respond to it. No, they said, yeah, no, that's right. That's the way Dad was. He was that way. He was this wild and crazy guy. And you got him just right. I had the same experience with Ernie's sons. Both of whom, again, Joey and Jerry, were very, very open with me. And they told me stories that were not exactly reflect well. Stories that painted Ernie as not maybe the best father in the world. How he would disappear whenever things got tough. He left it to his wife to take care of these two obstreperous young teenage boys. Ernie would get in his car and go, hey, look. I wondered how they would respond to it when they read it. They had told me these things, but now they're reading it in black and white. Well, I made an appearance in Pasadena, South Pasadena, on behalf of the book. We talked about it on Facebook. Jerry got in touch with me. I said, can I come? He said, yeah, you can come. I'll bring you up on the podium. You can talk. And he did. He talked about his dad and talked about some sweet stories about when they were young. I said, Jerry, do you mind telling some of the stories later in the book about the difficulties you had with your dad? I said, I don't mind at all. Once the session was over and I went to the back room to sign books, people mobbed Jerry. They wanted to hear more. But one of the things he said, and it really touched me, was that I wanted to thank Ron for peeling back the onion of my dad's life. It was as good a review as I got coming from where it came from. That made me feel good because, again, they had trusted me with some of these stories, and I was glad that he and people like Jeff Santo and some of the other people that I talked to thought that it was an honest portrayal.
Ron, I got a question for you if you can hear me.
Sure, I do.
All right. Yeah, fantastic. This is Jason.
Yeah,
So when I think about Ernie, he had just such a great career in terms of what he accomplished individually. But like you say, right, really lamented never making the postseason. Do you think he would have swapped his career for a guy like Charlie Neal who was, kind of average at shortstop, but had a great postseason and, came away with the title.
Oh, golly. Ernie loved being Ernie. I hope, but by talking about the downside, I'm only doing that because of a corrective to the image that we've had in our life for song. He loved his life. There was this one great, his career. There was this one great hole in it. I started talking about the 1969 season. I thought I know it'd be a long chapter, but I wanted to get into it. We had to tell the whole sad story. Well, once I started looking into it, it's 3 chapters. It takes up a huge amount of the book. 1 chapter about the Cubs, which and then leading us up to the fateful moment, and then 1 chapter about the Mets, and then 1 chapter about the what went wrong, trying to assess it. But Ernie was there. He was there. He was home at that moment, and it's almost a crime the way it ended. I talked about how we never had this World Series moment. Well, you got to remember that the Cubs were leading the league for 5 months. They were the toast of baseball. They were way ahead. Even in September, they were 5 games ahead. Then in October, they were. And now Ernie is finally getting this attention that I was talking about. New York Times is coming to town. Sports Illustrated is coming to town. They're following him around. They're following the Cubs around. Ernie had never had this. And the year before, 1968, the same thing had happened to Al Kaline, who had been this great, great player who had never been in the World Series. And Ernie was taking notice of all the excitement around Kaline. His Tigers got to the World Series. They won the World Series. Kaline had a great World Series. Hit over 300, had some key hits, played really well. Ernie was taking notes. Now it's his turn. Now he's on his great game. I'm going to do without Kaline. Now the writers are there, and he's putting on a show. There's a hilarious thing that Mark Cram wrote in Sports Illustrated about Ernie putting on a show for the assembled writers as they travel. Here we are in St. Louis, home of Stan Musial, home of the Hill. Here we are in New York, that toddling town, home to this and that. And he's just making jokes and doing rhymes. This is his moment. This is what's going to happen now. And you could see, as I researched it, as I wrote this, and I hope that as you read this was going to be his time. He was this close. He was going to get to the World Series. This was going to be his breakout thing that would make him remember, along with Willie and Mickey and Willie and Mickey. Didn't happen. It came apart just such a disastrous, tragic way. But in a way, I mean, it's a long way to go, but it was the ultimate metaphor of everything. His life became very difficult at the end, too. He was estranged from his wife. He was estranged from his kids. He was living alone. His health got bad on him. It all went downhill the last 3 or 4 years, and then the last 6 months. And all the beauty of his life ended up into this very unfortunate end. Just as all the wonderful, great moments of this, what was going to happen in his great career, and now he finally had this. It's going to be a World Series moment. This came apart tragically, disastrously.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's one of the questions from the chat from Michael. The collapse of '69, can that really be attributed to a lack of leadership in the clubhouse?
I can attribute it to one thing: Leo DeRocher. I mean, he just mismanaged that team so badly. Ernie Banks, again, the opening of that season, Leo had somebody else going to play. He ended up playing 155 games. So did Kessinger. Randy Hundley goes both ends of 9 doubleheaders. 9 in the heat. So I've got some examples of Leo going to Randy. Randy started wearing suspenders for the first time. He lost so much weight. He'd go to him at the end of the first game of a doubleheader. Randy, can you play? Look at me, Leo. Do I think I can play? Ah, you'll be all right. Get out. Ferguson Jenkins started 41 games. That's the most since Iron Man McGinnity in the 1900s. Tom Seaver started 35. Gil Hodges had the Mets on a 5-game rotation. Mets pitching staff on a 5-game rotation. At a time when that was quite unusual. For his trouble, Fergie, who started those 41 games at one point, Leo called him gutless. I mean, he just ran that team into the ground. Phil Regan, wonderful guy. He got him on the phone. He was in the bullpen. He was the only man who would bring out of the bullpen. Ted Abernathy with his sinker, Jim Colburn, who went on to win 20 games years later with the Milwaukee Brewers. Braves. Other really good people in the bullpen, but Leo didn't want to use them for this or that or the other reason. So at one time, Regan makes an appearance in 7 consecutive games. He's brought out of the building 7 consecutive times. The record for one pitcher to appear in consecutive games is 8. At least it was back then. On the 8th day, Fergie pitched a complete game. And Phil Regan went up to it and said, "Thank you very much. I didn't have money." But Leo missed that team so bad. There were other reasons too, but that team was just so tired. They were just so beat up. And there were other players on that bench. Paul Popovich played really well. Glenn Beckert got hurt a couple of times during the season. I think it was that season. And Popovich went in and played really well. But no, once Beckert was back, he was there. He was going to play. He never rotated his players. If you go look, Ernie wasn't the only one who played over 150 games. So did Billy Williams. So did Ron Rapoport. So did Beckert. It was a disastrous game. Somebody said that on the tombstone of 59 Cubs, it should be, "Here lie the 1969 Cubs. Death due to mismanagement."
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. There's a comment from Gary. "I shook hands with Ernie once in 1971, and I thought I put my hand in a vice. How do you account for the great strength he developed in his hands and wrists?"
Well, that's what made him a great hitter. I mean, he was just so strong. Early in his career, Bob Sheffing was the manager, and he grabbed Ernie by the arm and he said, his wrist is as big as most men's, forearms. He just had this tremendous wrist. How did he get it? He grew up playing softball. He didn't play baseball until he was a teenager, and he just really developed into this really skinny guy who had these tremendously strong wrists. One of the things that's forgotten about Ernie is that early in his career, he had more home runs as a shortstop than every other shortstop in the National League. He had over 40. And this was a big deal back then. And people would look at him, how could this skinny little guy hit all these home runs? Well, one reason was his wrist, and the other reason was that you saw Monty Irvin using a very small bat, 31-ounce bat, when everybody else was doing 35, 36, 37. And he and Hank Aaron were using these smaller bats, and they could kind of whip the ball into the stands. They just turned on, and the ball just flew into the stands. And it was kind of a big deal at the time that they were using these little bats and playing. And Ernie said he was sort of playing handball. Well, Arthur Daly, the great sports columnist of the New York Times, looked at what Ernie was doing and wrote a column about it and said, well, if the Bambino, if Babe had used that bat, he might have hit 100 of them. He kind of revolutionized. Pretty soon, everybody else was using thinner bats with thinner hands. He and Hank Aaron sort of revolutionized power hitting in that time. Again, it's forgotten. It's not really. If you go back and you look at the clips from that era, it was a huge deal. I mean, Ernie was lionized at that time. But as his career went on, and as he got older and could no longer run, so he couldn't hit for average anymore. And he would get sick. One year his eyes were bad. One year he had the mumps. He would have a good year and a bad year. Starting at the time he was about 32 or 3, might have had his first bad year. People would say, is this the end of Ernie Banks? Well, is this the end of Ernie Banks? Happened about 4 or 5 more times. Then he'd come back with another really great year.
Well, one of the questions I was thinking about just now, you're talking about power, and for so long, Ernie was the team leader in home runs, but that eventually that mark was passed by Sammy Sosa. Did you ever get his opinion about Sosa and maybe the PED steroid era?
No, that's a good question. I did not ask him. I didn't get into his feelings about later, baseball later. I was too busy, I guess, or too caught up in telling his life and trying to reconstruct the Cubs of that era. I don't think Ernie would have cared that much. I think he loved Sammy. He loved the Cubs. He loved being around them at that time. But I guess I really don't have a good answer to that question. I hope it's okay to say that.
Yeah, no, totally fine. So, and I know we're running really close to 3 o'clock, so we only have a few more minutes.
Okay.
I want to turn it over to everybody else. Feel free to chime in with any questions you might have.
Hi. Thank you so much to SABR for hosting. I'm a lifelong baseball fan, grew up on the south side of Chicago, still here. Ernie Banks was not really known as a sort of outspoken civil rights advocate. Did he ever express any regret about not being more outspoken back in the days?
Yes, you're right. Yes, he did. I'll tell you, but you're absolutely right. He was not an outspoken advocate. And this is at a time when the civil rights revolution was heating up here in the 60s. Protests, sit-ins, marches, that sort of thing. And again, you have to go back to what I said before was his whole life was avoiding drama, avoiding conflict, avoiding any kind of controversy. So Hank Aaron, who very much was involved in the civil rights revolution, called Ernie. He called Willie Mays. And he said, you guys have got to help. I can't do much here in Milwaukee and then later in Atlanta. You guys need to speak out too. Ernie just wouldn't do it. It wasn't his nature. So he was very cautious about it. And he took a lot of heat. People were saying that, militant members of the black community were saying that this is a terrible thing for Ernie to have done. He should have spoken up. The roughest thing that was said about him, Michael, was, I never was able to find out who said this, but somebody was going to say, Ernie's not a Negro. He's never, Ernie's not a militant white. He's never even been a Negro. I mean, that was really hard. Trying to reconstruct, I'm trying to get that later, in a later era, now 15 years later. I went and talked to Jesse Jackson. I talked to Timmy Black, who's still going, I think, over 100 years old, a revered historian and member of the black community. And they both had a different look at it. What Jesse Jackson said was that some people, express their views by doing, by saying, and some by doing. And Ernie did. When Ernie went out there every day and played, he showed that black players were ready. He showed what the black players could do. He showed that blacks were ready to take this role. And he played a very strong role in it. He said that, and Timmy Black told me the same thing, some by doing. I think I told you that some of the Facebook comments I got really intrigued me. Well, one comment I got was from a young white man on the north side of Chicago, who was a youngster, probably not even a teenager, but he wasn't around any black people. He never saw them. They weren't in his community. He would run home like so many kids did in that area from school to catch the tail end of the Cubs game. And he remembered seeing Ernie being interviewed by Jack Burkhouse. And Jack and Ernie would say, they would just have a conversation, man to man. And at the end of it, Jack would reach out, and Ernie would reach out and shake each other's hands. And to this day, that young boy, who's now in his 60s or older, remembers that. It was something that struck him at the time. You asked if he ever said he was sorry for it, and he did. A friend of mine named Steve Jacobson wrote a book called Chasing Jackie's Flag, the players who came after him. And Ernie did say And when he went back and he saw the footage in a later era of the struggles and the sit-downs and the hoses and the beatings and the cottons and the horses, that said he wished he had been more. But he wished he'd been more involved. But that just was not, it just wasn't the way he behaved. For the same reason he didn't complain about Leo DeRocher, the same reason, that he didn't complain about lots of things in his life. He wasn't going to get involved in this controversy this time.
Great.
Thank you. Hey, can I ask one question?
For sure.
Hey, Ron, like the rest of us, stuck at home here, and I'm listening to iHeartRadio streaming, and they have a thing where they talk about history and sports. Something that they threw out this week that I had never known was, I think it was back in 1971, where DeRocher got thrown out of a game. Ernie became the manager, quote unquote, making him the first black manager ever. I've never known that until I heard that this week. Is that true?
That's a good story. However, it was in 1974, I think, and Whitey Lockman was the manager, or Jim Marshall. It was farther down the road. And they've gone on to say that Ernie became the first black manager. Unfortunately, that's incorrect. The first black manager took place 10 years earlier. And guess who it was? Gene Baker. Remember, Baker and Banks were the first. Gene Baker was a fine young infielder who came up with Ernie. They were the first two black players together. His career ended when he took a shot off his knee and a ball hit by Curt Flood. And he came back and he couldn't really make it as a manager, but the Pirates loved him. So they made him a coach. And he was on the team once when I think it was Danny Murtaugh got kicked out. And then also the coach. And Baker became the manager. This was like 10 years earlier. It was in the 60s. So I've seen this story about Ernie, and Ernie has repeated it too. But he was just incorrect. And it happened 10 years earlier. But it wasn't Leo getting kicked out. I think it was Whitey Lockman. I'd have to go back and look in the book. Good story though. But you're right. Without sports, everybody's desperate for something to fill the time.
Right.
I look at ESPN today and I'm going, whoa. They're really struggling. These games in Korea, South Korea. And I really think that's one of the reasons that the Michael Jordan documentary is getting so much attention. It's wonderful. It's great stuff to watch. But it's all there is to watch. So instead of being a little story in the paper, it's the whole sports page because there's nothing else. It's the closest thing to live sports that we've got.
Right.
Ron,
Okay.
how badly did he want to manage the Cubs, and did that lead to his depression or his sadness?
He was very much of two minds. He said he didn't want to, and Phil Wrigley said he really shouldn't, and so on. But then every so often later on, he would say he did want to. It would have been great. I would have liked to. He would have been a disaster. I mean, because he was so, he was so non-confrontational. He wouldn't have been able to deal with players on an individual level. It wouldn't have worked out well for him at all. He was very lucky. The worst thing that could have happened to Ernie was for him to have been the manager of a Cub team, of another terrible Cub team. It would have been a real blot on his legacy. Yes, and I note in the book that he said he wished they would ask him. But I think he knew deep in his heart that it wouldn't have been a smart thing for him to do.
Great. Any other final questions?
Well, thanks for having me. It's been great. I've really enjoyed this. I'd rather be at a ball game or throwing a ball with my grandson.
Right. We were actually supposed to be in Milwaukee for a game tonight. So
yeah,
I know how you feel.
This is just such a tragedy for all of us,
Yeah.
not just for baseball. But I really enjoyed talking to you. I'm glad so many of you are interested. And it's been a lot of fun. And I hope if you read the book, it'll bring back some memories and maybe tell you a few things that I didn't know about Ernie. And just
Sure.
find out. And,
Sure. Any particular places you'd recommend? Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, any places you recommend to pick up the book?
Well, it's on Amazon, the paperback. recently. It's fairly recent. I was able to get a little bit of a book tour in until
Sure.
I met Perry in Arizona, and we were able to talk a little bit about the book and make a few appearances. But then it all hit at exactly that moment. The windup of my tour was supposed to be the Tucson Book Festival, but they called it off just before. So I came home to face the music.
Sure.
Perry is still in Arizona.
Yeah.
So but no, it's on Amazon. It's on. If there are any bookstores that are open in your neighborhood, it's there too. Barnes and Noble has a website, and Hachette Books has a website, but it's very much available. And there's an audiobook, by the way, by Charlie Steiner, the voice of the Dodgers, who was on ESPN for many years, and he did a great job. I was there, this great stentorian, operatic voice reading the final chapter, and I was there watching it. And I don't think we're going to do the director, producer. I don't think we're going to do the acknowledgement. We don't really do those. I said, no, I wish you would, because I tell some stories about how the book came about, the story about trying to get Ernie to write an autobiography. So they said, okay, well, you do it. So after 20 chapters of Charlie's, I'm talking about really grateful. Didn't really play very well against Charlie's voice. But it's really good, that audiobook, if you're into that sort of.
Great.
And
well, thank you very much. Go ahead.
Buy the book. I have book plates that I can sign. If you want me to sign it, you could put it right on the title page, or I would sign it if we were together at a bookstore. Send me your address, and I'll sign a book plate and stick it in the mail to you. You can put it in front of the book and pretend that we met.
What's the best way to reach you?
I'm on Facebook, or I'm at rjrapoport.com, gmail.com. Or you can go online and find me. Just Google me. You'll find my website, rjrapoport@gmail.com. Or friend me on Facebook, or send me a message on Facebook. A lot of people have been reaching me that way lately.
Great.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. So just as we close up, keep checking our SABR Chicago Facebook page for upcoming events. We have events booked through the rest of the month, and different topics everywhere. And again, I thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Bill.
Great. Thank you.
Way to go, Ron.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it. Bye, Perry.
Thanks,
Great.
Ron.
Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.